Welcome to our channel. Before we get started, please consider liking and subscribing so we can bring more stories like this to you. I never intended to spark a neighborhood feud when I decided to hold a weekend rummage sale. Our quiet community tends to keep to itself, so I assumed the event would go unnoticed or, at worst, raise an eyebrow or two. That assumption was my first mistake. I'm 64, retired from a decades-long career in local government, and have been living in this HOA for nearly 5 years. My wife, who shares my sense of humor and knack for collecting interesting things, decided it was time to downsize. We had an entire storage unit's worth of old family keepsakes, antique furniture, knickknacks from my grandparents, and even a few rare items we acquired during our traveling days. We realized we could earn a bit of extra cash and free up space in our garage, so the rummage sale felt like a practical plan. Here's where Karen comes in. She's the HOA president, but that's putting it lightly. She might as well be a monarch reigning over a kingdom of cul-de-sacs. Karen is somewhere in her early 50s, rare in our mostly older community, and she seems determined to make her mark by overseeing every last detail of our neighborhood. While her involvement can be helpful, like organizing volunteers to keep the common walking trails clean, she takes her position to extremes. In her eyes, any rule that isn't in the HOA handbook probably just needs to be added. A few weeks before my rummage sale, I politely informed Karen, hoping she'd let me place a flyer on the community bulletin board. I wanted to do everything by the book, in case there was some obscure rule about yard sales. Karen blinked as I spoke, her lips in a tight line, then gave me a quick, "We'll see," without further explanation. She never got back to me, so I figured no news was good news. When sale day arrived, I set out a couple of folding tables on my driveway. We displayed vintage dishware, porcelain figurines my wife inherited from her mother, and some framed paintings that no longer fit our decor. 4 hours, everything ran smoothly. Folks from around the neighborhood stopped by to chat and browse, trading the usual small talk about local events. The atmosphere was convivial, like a little block party. Shortly after lunch, I noticed Karen pacing at the corner of my yard, clipboard in hand. She was scribbling furiously while glancing over at my tables. Something about the way she held her pen, white-knuckled and trembling, made me uneasy. I walked over and asked if everything was okay. She gave me a frosty stare and said, "I don't recall approving an event with this much traffic. This looks more like a commercial operation than a simple rummage sale." I tried to keep my tone even. "Karen, no one's blocking the street, and it's just neighbors. I'm not opening a store out of my house. It's a one-day sale, for goodness sake." HOA guidelines clearly state that any private sale of goods that might cause excessive car traffic requires prior written approval. She tapped her pen on the clipboard. "I have to document the violation. I'm sorry, but rules are rules." I wasn't aware of any such regulation. I asked if she could show me where, exactly, it was written. She flicked through pages of typed and highlighted rules but didn't pinpoint anything. Instead, she said, "I'll have it on record soon enough. Expect a formal letter." My wife, overhearing this conversation, joined us. She gently suggested Karen could have told us beforehand if there was a real issue. Karen just huffed, said we should wrap things up quickly, and spun on her heel. We tried to continue the sale as if nothing had happened, but the mood had shifted. Several neighbors asked if something was wrong because they noticed Karen marching around like she owned the sidewalk. One even joked that we should charge her a fee just for scowling at our belongings. By mid-afternoon, I thought the worst was behind us, until I spotted a police cruiser slowly turning onto our street. My heart sank. We'd lived here 5 peaceful years, never causing any trouble. Yet there it was, a patrol car parking right in front of my driveway. A young officer stepped out, adjusting his cap nervously, like he wasn't exactly sure what was going on. He took in the scene, old dishes, vintage chairs, a few shoppers haggling over a table lamp. Nothing remotely illegal about it. But Karen, who had reappeared with a triumphant smile, waved him over immediately. I overheard snippets of her animated explanation. Words like unregistered commercial activity and suspected stolen goods floated in the air. I approached cautiously, trying not to look offended by her outrageous claims, though my jaw was nearly on the ground. My mind raced. Stolen goods? All we had were family heirlooms and second-hand decorative items. Who would conjure up such a lie, and why? As I stood there, the officer turned to me and my wife with a puzzled expression. Sir, I received a call about unauthorized commerce and possible trafficking of stolen property. Could you clarify what's going on? Before we could answer, Karen interjected. Yes, officer, they've been selling old items all day without the HOA's permission. I also have reason to believe some of the antiques belong to our neighborhood clubhouse. What in the world was she talking about? We'd never set foot in the clubhouse's locked storage, let alone stolen anything. Our rummage sale was all personal stuff we'd accumulated over decades. I felt my blood pressure spike, but I forced myself to remain calm. I took a breath, ready to explain it all to the officer. I felt more disbelief than fear. Who would buy Karen's ridiculous story? Yet part of me worried, because when the police get involved, nothing feels guaranteed. Standing there, front yard full of onlookers, I realized my friendly rummage sale had turned into something bigger than I ever anticipated. And Karen, with her clipboard and cunning smile, wasn't backing down. The officer asked for some space to sort out the situation, so we guided him into our entryway while the few remaining shoppers looked on, clearly uneasy. Karen wasn't invited inside, but she followed us right up to the door, arms crossed tight over her chest, as if she were personally overseeing the interrogation. Let's start with your statement, the officer said to me, ignoring Karen for the moment. I explained how these items were from my personal collection, antiques passed down through my family or collected from flea markets over the years. I emphasized that this was a one-day rummage sale, not a permanent business venture. My wife chimed in, detailing the history of some items: a porcelain vase from her grandmother's attic, a wooden rocking chair her father built decades ago. When we finished, the officer turned to Karen, who had inched her way into the foyer, practically stepping on his toes. He asked, "Could you share your specific evidence that there's stolen property here?" Karen dramatically flipped through her clipboard pages. I have records showing that a set of antique plates once went missing from the neighborhood clubhouse. Those plates look suspiciously like the ones they're selling. She pointed toward our driveway. The officer blinked, clearly not convinced. He cleared his throat and said, "Do you have any proof these are the same plates? Photographs, descriptions, receipts?" Karen's lips tightened. "We never had the chance to take photos," she said quickly, "but I distinctly remember the floral pattern. It's identical. This can't be a coincidence." My wife, becoming exasperated, grabbed one of the plates from a table near the front door. "Officer, look at this maker's mark. This plate is from my grandmother's collection, made in England in 1935. See the hallmark on the back? Does the clubhouse keep a similar inventory or any official records?" Karen's eyes darted away. She muttered something about the HOA not keeping consistent records. The officer let out a long sigh. "Without concrete evidence, I can't declare these items stolen. However, Ms. Karen, you mentioned an unregistered commercial activity. Is there an HOA regulation stating rummage sales are prohibited?" "That's correct," Karen said firmly. "We need at least 30 days' notice for large gatherings. I have the authority to levy fines." I watched the officer's stance shift, less law enforcement and more neighborly mediator. He turned to me and said, "This might be more of a civil HOA matter than a criminal one. You're not under investigation for theft if there's no proof. But if your HOA requires permits or approval for events, that could be a violation of their rules." I felt a small sense of relief that we weren't about to be handcuffed over our old porcelain plates. But the worry returned quickly. We could still be slapped with who knew what kind of fine. Karen's not the type to let go easily, and a simple rummage sale could turn into a costly headache. The officer left, reminding us to resolve things through the HOA channels and to keep the peace. Once his cruiser disappeared down the street, Karen aimed a pointed finger at me. "I'm filing a formal complaint with the HOA board. Expect a hefty penalty." Then she pivoted and stomped away. I thought that was the end of the drama for the day, but around dinner time, we got an email from the HOA board's official address, copied to Karen and the other board members, declaring that we had violated multiple association guidelines. They mentioned selling goods in a manner consistent with commercial practice and failing to register an event that would disrupt neighborly order. The email threatened potential legal action if we didn't immediately pay a penalty of $500 and promise never to host another sale. My wife and I sat at the kitchen table, reading the email in disbelief. It felt like we were being railroaded. We'd lived here peacefully for years, and so many neighbors told us they actually appreciated the chance to buy items at a modest cost. Some even joked they might hold rummage sales of their own in the future. I decided it was time to dig into the HOA's rulebook. Late that night, I flipped through endless pages of fine print, scanning for anything remotely referencing rummage sales. The language was vague at best, and nowhere did I see a specific 30-day notice clause for personal sales. There were guidelines about large gatherings, over 50 people at once, but we'd had nowhere near that number. It was a steady trickle of visitors throughout the day, nothing that blocked traffic or infringed on anyone's driveway. In the morning, I phoned a couple of fellow residents I trust, including Jason, a retired lawyer who has lived here even longer than we have. Jason was appalled by the notion that we could be penalized so harshly for something the rulebook barely addressed. He asked if we had any documents that might prove we had tried to clear things with Karen in advance. I saved screenshots of my text conversation with her from weeks ago, where I asked about placing a notice on the community board. She had read the message but never responded. "That's good," Jason said. "It shows you made a good faith effort to inform them. Keep that handy." He also suggested I reply to the HOA email, requesting a hearing to discuss the alleged violation. It was within our rights as residents to have an in-person meeting with the board before any fine was imposed. So I did exactly that. My email back to them was polite but firm: "We dispute any wrongdoing and want a formal hearing to review the rulebook and the alleged violation." Later that evening, I got a text from Karen: "I saw your email. This won't go in your favor, trust me. The board supports me 100%. You should just pay the fine and move on. This is your final warning." A mix of anger and fear rushed over me. How far was she willing to go? She had already accused me of stolen property in front of a police officer. No apology, no retraction. Then she threatened me with an outrageous fine for a rummage sale that nobody else in the neighborhood seemed to have a problem with. I decided to push forward with the hearing, determined to see this through. I refused to believe the entire board blindly followed Karen's every whim. Maybe some of them just went along with her because she was loud and intimidating. If there was any shred of fairness left in our community, they'd give me a fair shot. Little did I know, Karen had something else up her sleeve, an outlandish move that would drag this conflict out of the neighborhood and into a place I never thought I'd find myself at my age. A week later, I walked into our community's clubhouse for the hearing. Despite Karen's ominous warnings, I tried to remain optimistic. Inside, a long folding table was set up at the front, where 5 board members sat in a row, Karen in the middle, looking smug with her arms folded, a thick binder in front of her. Neighbors had gathered in the back, whispering among themselves. I spotted Jason, my lawyer friend, giving me a small nod of encouragement. It felt almost like walking into a courtroom. One of the board members, Dan, cleared his throat and read the charge: violating neighborhood standards by hosting an unauthorized event that caused undue disturbance. He motioned for me to speak. I explained, step by step, how I tried to let Karen know about the sale, how we had only moderate traffic throughout the day, and how nothing in the rules explicitly forbid a private rummage sale. Jason then outlined the relevant sections of the covenant: no specific mention of rummage sales, no mention of a 30-day notice for an event with fewer than 50 attendees. Karen, with a thin smile, opened her binder. "We've had problems before with unregulated gatherings leading to theft, noise complaints, and trespassing. These activities degrade our property values. I have a duty to protect this community." She shot me a sideways glance. "I also want to remind everyone that the police were called, verifying how serious the situation was." Someone in the audience snorted. A neighbor spoke up: "Karen, you called the police. We saw you do it. It wasn't some concerned onlooker." Karen's eyes narrowed. Regardless, the involvement of law enforcement proves that lines were crossed. The hearing lasted over an hour, with back and forth bickering. Finally, The board went into a brief private discussion. They returned with a surprising verdict. They sided with Karen that I had violated the spirit of the regulations, but they reduced the fine to $200. I felt my face grow hot. Even a smaller fine was an admission of guilt, which I refused to accept. This was more about principle than money. Quietly, I conferred with Jason, who pulled me aside. If you want, you can pay the $200 and put this behind you. But if you believe this is harassment, you have the option to push further. It might mean going to small claims court. Karen was already packing up, clearly pleased with herself. She didn't expect me to fight back. That's when I made a snap decision: I'm taking this to court. The announcement stirred a ripple of surprise through the crowd. Karen's face twitched into a mixture of shock and irritation. She snapped, "Fine. Waste your money. I'm sure the judge will see that you broke the rules and..." "I intend to pursue a defamation claim as well," I cut in, my voice level. "Your false accusation about stolen goods put me at risk of criminal suspicion. I have witnesses and a police report that found no such evidence." For the first time, Karen looked uneasy. She fumbled with her binder, then composed herself. "That's ridiculous. I was doing my job." Jason stepped forward. Accusing someone of criminal activity without proof, especially in writing or in front of witnesses, can be grounds for defamation if it harms their reputation. My client is well within his rights to file. We left the clubhouse feeling a wave of empowerment, but also a flicker of dread. The next morning, Jason helped me draft a formal letter of intent to sue, addressing both the HOA and Karen personally. We stated that we would seek damages for defamation if they did not rescind the fine and issue a written apology. For 2 days, I heard nothing. Then an email from the board's general address arrived. It read, in essence, that they would review the matter further. No apology, no fine waiver. Since I wasn't bluffing, Jason filed on my behalf at small claims court. I'll never forget the look on Karen's face when she realized how serious things had become. She fired back with an angry letter, questioning my character and calling me a legal bully. The court date arrived a few weeks later. Jason represented me at the hearing, which took place in a modest county courtroom. Karen brought a different board member with her for support. Despite the tension, the actual process was fairly quick. The judge reviewed the police report noting the call Karen had made, the unsubstantiated claim of stolen goods, and the HOA rulebook that had no explicit rummage sale prohibition. Karen tried to argue that the association's broad language about protecting neighborhood harmony gave her the right to call the police on suspicious activity. The judge didn't buy it. "This rummage sale was not suspicious," he said plainly. "A misguided claim of stolen property, with no proof, can indeed constitute defamation if it harms the accused party's reputation." In the end, the judge dismissed the fine entirely, ruling that the HOA had acted beyond their established regulations. As for the defamation claim, the judge stated that Karen's false accusation could warrant damages, but he didn't assign a massive judgment, just $500 plus court costs. That might not sound like a lot, but it was vindication for me. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt a mixture of triumph and relief. Jason clapped me on the back. "You proved you're not the pushover Karen thought you were. And the HOA can't just make up rules on the fly." Word spread quickly back home. A few neighbors confessed they'd been afraid to speak up against Karen, worried she'd target them next. As for the HOA board, they quietly accepted the judge's ruling. Karen, however, tried to spin it like she had only been doing her due diligence. Yet, at the next neighborhood board election, her name was curiously missing from the ballot. I still live in the same house, rummage sale or not. But one thing is clear, the HOA is a little more careful about how it enforces rules now. And Karen, stripped of her self-appointed crown, no longer prowls the streets with that clipboard. If my experience taught me anything, it's that standing up to petty tyranny can be intimidating, especially when the police or the courts get involved, but sometimes it's the only way to reclaim your peace.